There were no paintings hanging on the wall. George had never seen an original painting. This is quite unusual when you think about this in today's world, and when we're constantly pushing for more and more of the arts in school, and we're also big with the arts at home with our children. This just didn't happen back then, and the idea of becoming an artist was something that nobody in George's world had ever even heard of. Well, so how did George become an artist out of that sort of a community? Well, he was an only child. His parents were older when they had him. I mean, he actually had tons of cousins, by the way. His mother was one of 11 and his father was one of 13, and they were first cousins. It was a real small town.
That's why it came out so good.
Yeah. So when George was in the 3rd grade, he contracted polio. For you young kids in here, that was a terrible disease. It was highly contagious. And what it meant, usually, was that you were unable to walk. And that is what happened with George. Fortunately, obviously, he had a full recovery. But he was bedridden for about 6 months when he was only 8 years old. So what is a mother to do? Highly contagious, you can't have kids over, they don't even own a TV, no computers. Big, big problem. How is she supposed to entertain him? And so it was just fortunate that right about that same time, a great invention came out to entertain young George. Anybody want to take a guess? Paint by number. George's mother brought in these paint by number sets, and George looked at these, and you know, if anybody remember the paint by numbers, a lot of them were like country lanes and baskets of flowers, and the most popular, the Last Supper, was a really big one. All of those. Well, this didn't interest little 8-year-old George at all, painting these subjects, but he did like the idea of the paints, and of course, again, he was bored. He needed something to do. So he used the paints and turned the canvases over and painted his own pictures, his own ideas, and this was something that he has kept with him all the way to today. He painted the things he knows and loves the best, which for a little boy in New Iberia was alligators and crawfish and nutria and cowboys and firemen and all sorts of things like that. So that's what he painted, and he told his mother, oh, and she also brought him sculpting clay. He made all sorts of neat sculptures. He told his mother right then, he said, I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. And she said, okay, it's sort of like saying you're going to be president when you grow up. It just had no real meaning or connection for her, but he was serious. And so he kept painting and kept drawing, and by the time he reached college, he went to USL, now University of Louisiana at Lafayette, then it was USL, and he stayed there for 6 semesters. They did have art classes there. George was able to take his very first art classes, but he was very interested in learning the fundamentals of art. In other words, he wanted to learn figure drawing. He wanted to learn about design and shape and line. And the academic art of the day, what everyone was teaching, was not that. It was abstract expressionism. It was all about thinking and things in a different way, approaching your canvas with your emotions. Well, he said, that's all fine and dandy, but I still want to learn how to draw. I still want to learn all these other things. So he was very frustrated with the academic sort of teaching that was going on. And that was all that was happening at that time in the university level. So he learned through a friend about art school, an art school called the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. And again, George didn't have access to finding out about art schools. It was just kind of a fluke that he found out about this one. He mailed off his portfolio that he had put together at USL, and he was accepted. Now think about that. Never been out of South Louisiana. It's the 1960s. He gets on a train, and he goes to Los Angeles by himself. Completely different world. And it wasn't until he got there that he learned that this was a graduate school. To this day, George is the only student they've ever accepted that did not have an undergraduate degree. Quite amazing that this young man did all of this.
Accident.
That's why I'm up here, because I can brag about him and he would not brag about himself. So, it was quite wonderful. He gets there, and sure enough, they're also teaching abstract expressionism, but they're also teaching the fundamentals. And George takes all these wonderful classes, the figurative classes, all the wonderful things that he really wanted to learn about and wanted to understand with art. The other very important thing that he was able to do there was he was able to study under real artists, under professionals. These were guest artists that they had come in and teach. One of the most famous that George studied under was a man named Lois Feigelson, who was an abstract expressionist, but very famous for what he called the hard edge painting. And this really stuck with George, this idea of hard edge and creating your own shapes. Not just the regular circle and triangle, but any kind of hard shape. Now think about George's career. Think about the shape of the oak tree. Think about the shape of the blue dog. These are circles and squares and triangles and specific hard edge shapes. So this really made an impression on him. The other thing that made a big impression on him was in 1966, a very famous show opened in Los Angeles at the Ferris Gallery. It's a landmark show to this day, and that was Andy Warhol in his Campbell soup cans. It was on the front page of the LA Times. And George and all of his fellow students went running to see this show that, as often happens, the professors were a little bit late to catch up, and they all hated it, and all the students went crazy. It was all kind of a little bit behind. And so this made a huge impact on him as well. Now what about Andy Warhol did that? Well, think about it. Andy Warhol took items from the popular culture, the dollar bills, the Campbell soup can, the Brillo boxes, and he took things that we knew as something else and turned them into art. This was phenomenal. Nobody had ever done this before. He also reproduced them using hard edges, using broad shapes and patterns, bold color, this hard acrylic, fast-drying paint. It was all very interesting for these young students. The other thing that was very key for George about Warhol was the repetitive imagery. This idea that you can do something, the same thing, again and again and again, and yet it is different every time because of the shapes, because of the designs. Because when George walks up to a canvas, he's not seeing a dog, he's not seeing a tree, he's seeing the shapes. The shapes within that dog, the shapes around it, all of the shapes in the piece. And that is what keeps it interesting to him. He's not, I've often said about George, and I've heard him describe himself this way too, that he's an abstract artist who happens to paint things that we all recognize. Because that's how he looks at it. So after art school, he's coming back to South Louisiana. Now that was very interesting. George was the only student that he knew among his peers at Art Center that went home, wherever that home was. Everybody else, without question, went to New York. But George said, I want to go home, I want to go to Louisiana. He really missed it. He loves the state so much. He's lived here all of his life, other than those few years in LA, and he has no intention of leaving. And he said, not only am I going to go home, I'm going to preserve my culture, because I see it dying. He would come back from LA, and he would see the horse and buggies were no longer running in Arnaville. He would see that as the Cajun culture became more popular, they always say that there's this explosion, and then the culture kind of dies because it becomes a tourist thing, and you lose some of those things that are inherent. It all becomes blurred, you know? What is that thing that is really what the culture is, and what is that thing that the culture is expected to be by the outside world? He saw all of this happening, and he said, I'm going to preserve the Cajun culture. So how's he going to do that? And how's he going to apply all those rules and all those things that he's learned and all those things that interest him from art school? Well, the first thing he has to do is find his shape, his Campbell soup can. And he does that visually. George is driving his car, this time he has a car when he leaves art school, and he's driving back from California, very long drive, and on the way he has to cross the big state of Texas, which has big, huge skies. And what happens when you cross the Sabine River is that suddenly, the way he saw it, the skies are small. And the sky is small because you're not looking at it overhead, you're looking at it from underneath the trees. And that's how the Cajuns lived. They lived underneath the trees. The Cajuns from the 19th century. Everything from drying the moss to eating their meals to anything, just escaping the sun. And so he picked the oak tree as his symbol. Now, how are you going to paint an oak tree, paint a landscape, and paint it in a way that nobody else has done? Make it grown and make it a contemporary shape.